about to tell you something that's going to sound completely insane. I've got the footage to prove it, but even watching it myself, I still can't believe what happened to my family last winter. My little sister disappeared into the wilderness, and what I captured on my trail cameras will haunt me forever. It started as what was supposed to be the perfect family winter camping trip. My parents had been planning this getaway to the remote Pacific Northwest for months. We're talking deep wilderness here, the kind of place where you drive for hours on logging roads that barely qualify as roads, then snowshoe for 3 days just to reach a spot where you can set up camp without seeing another human soul. My dad loves that kind of isolation. At 45, he's always been the outdoorsy type, and he wanted to share that passion with me and my sister before I headed off to college in the fall. I'm 19, so this was probably going to be our last big family adventure for a while. My sister Emma had just turned 11 a few weeks before the trip, and she was more excited than I'd ever seen her about winter camping. The thing about Emma is that she's always been obsessed with finding things that aren't supposed to exist. Monsters, cryptids, whatever you want to call them. She watches all those paranormal investigation shows religiously and reads every book about mysterious creatures she can get her hands on. My parents think it's just a phase, but she's been like this since she was 7 or 8, always talking about Bigfoot, always convinced she's going to be the one to finally prove these things exist. So when Dad mentioned we were going deep into Sasquatch country during winter, specifically the Olympic Peninsula region where there had been dozens of reported sightings over the decades, and where the creatures supposedly moved to lower elevations during the snowy months, Emma absolutely lost her mind with excitement. She spent weeks before the trip researching winter Bigfoot behavior, printing out maps of supposed cold weather sightings, even bringing a notebook to document any evidence she might find. My parents thought it was cute. I thought it was weird but harmless. We packed more gear than we probably needed for winter camping. Dad brought his usual cold weather equipment plus some new Arctic-rated items he'd been wanting to test. Mom packed enough food for a week even though we were only planning to stay 4 days. And I brought my trail cameras, 3 state-of-the-art Reconyx Hyperfire cameras that I'd saved up for over the past year. These weren't cheap consumer models. They were professional-grade units capable of capturing high-definition video in complete darkness using advanced infrared technology, and they were specifically designed to function in sub-freezing temperatures. I'd gotten really into wildlife photography, and winter seemed like the perfect opportunity to capture some shots of deer, elk, maybe even a bear preparing for hibernation. The cameras could record continuously for weeks on their lithium battery packs, and their motion sensors were sensitive enough to detect movement from over 100 feet away, even in snow conditions. The drive took forever through increasingly treacherous winter roads. We left early on a Thursday morning in February and didn't reach the trailhead until late afternoon. The last 2 hours were on Forest Service Road 2184, a narrow, winding dirt road that was partially snow-covered and made my mom grip the door handle and close her eyes on the sharp turns. No cell service, no other vehicles, just endless snow-laden forest on both sides. Emma spent the entire drive with her face pressed to the window, scanning the white landscape like she expected a Bigfoot to just step out from behind a snow-covered tree and wave at us. Every few miles, she'd point excitedly at shadows between the trees or unusual formations in the snow, convinced she'd spotted something unusual. Dad would slow down and look, always patient with her enthusiasm, though we never saw anything more than snow-covered stumps and fallen logs that her imagination transformed into mysterious creatures. The snowshoe trek in was brutal. 3 days of carrying heavy winter packs through terrain that was challenging even in good weather. Dad had picked this spot specifically because it was so remote and nearly impossible to access during winter months. He'd found it on some obscure winter camping forum where serious cold weather backpackers shared coordinates for places that weren't on any official maps. The kind of location that true wilderness enthusiasts guard jealously. Our route took us along an abandoned logging trail for the first day, then up a steep ridgeline that had us gaining 2,000 feet of elevation in just 4 miles while breaking trail through knee-deep snow. Emma, despite being the smallest member of our group, kept pace better than any of us expected. Her excitement seemed to fuel her endurance even in the harsh conditions. On the second day, we snowshoed through a section of old-growth forest where the trees were so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't circle their trunks. The forest felt ancient and undisturbed, transformed into a winter wonderland that seemed almost magical. Shafts of weak winter sunlight filtered through the snow-laden canopy hundreds of feet above us, creating ethereal columns of light and shadow. The only sounds were our own labored breathing, the crunch of snow under our snowshoes, and the occasional crack of a tree adjusting to the cold. Emma was in her element, constantly stopping to examine unusual patterns in the snow, tree scrapes that might have been made by large animals, and areas where the snow had been disturbed in ways that seemed significant to her trained eye. She documented everything in her notebook with the methodical precision of a genuine researcher, even while wearing thick winter gloves. Her enthusiasm was infectious, even though I remained skeptical about her monster hunting theories. On the second night, as we camped in a protected grove beside a partially frozen alpine stream, Emma made her first significant discovery. She found what she claimed were large tracks in the snow near our camp, partially filled in by wind-blown snow but still clearly visible to her experienced eye. The tracks were indeed unusually large, much bigger than any of our snowshoes, and had a distinctly humanoid shape with clear impressions that suggested bare feet rather than any kind of footwear. Dad examined them carefully and suggested they might be from a large black bear that had been walking upright through the snow, which was possible but didn't quite explain the shape and depth of the impressions. Mom remained diplomatically neutral, neither encouraging Emma's theories nor dismissing them outright. I took photos of the tracks with my phone, more for documentation than because I believed they were evidence of anything extraordinary. By the time we finally reached our designated campsite on the third day, we were all exhausted but exhilarated by the stunning winter landscape. The location exceeded even Dad's expectations. It was a small clearing beside a crystal-clear creek that was mostly frozen except for a narrow channel of running water, surrounded by the biggest snow-covered trees I'd ever seen. The kind of place that feels ancient and untouched, like humans had never been there before. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, with the creek running along one edge. Dense winter forests surrounded us on all sides, with what appeared to be game trails visible as depressions in the snow leading off in multiple directions. It was perfect for winter wildlife photography, which is why I immediately started scouting locations for my trail cameras. Setting up the cameras in winter conditions required extra strategic thinking. I wanted to capture the maximum amount of wildlife activity while ensuring the units remained hidden, secure, and functional in the cold. The first camera went beside the creek, positioned to monitor the natural water source where animals would come to drink from the unfrozen section. The second, I placed along a well-worn game trail that showed clear signs of regular use by deer and possibly larger animals, evidenced by tracks in the snow. The third camera took more consideration. I wanted to position it to capture anything approaching our campsite from the forest, but I also needed to angle it to avoid recording our normal camp activities while ensuring it had a clear view through the winter conditions. I finally mounted it on a large cedar tree about 60 yards from our tent area, with a clear view of the main approach routes through the forest. Each camera was programmed to record 30-second video clips when motion was detected, with a 5-second delay between potential triggers. They were set to operate continuously, 24 hours a day, storing footage on high-capacity SD cards that could hold weeks of recordings. The winter conditions would actually help with battery life, as the cold temperatures would slow the chemical reactions that drained power. Emma watched me set up every camera with intense interest, asking detailed questions about their capabilities and coverage areas despite the bitter cold. I explained how the motion sensors worked when they'd start recording and what kind of animals I expected to capture during winter months. She was practically vibrating with excitement even while bundled up in her bright red winter jacket, and I could tell she was already planning to sneak out and look for her precious monsters the first chance she got. That first evening was perfect despite the harsh conditions. We cooked dinner on our camp stove inside the cooking shelter Dad had set up, melted snow for drinking water, and told stories while staying warm in our winter gear. Emma kept asking Dad about local legends and whether he'd ever heard any winter Bigfoot stories from this specific area. He humored her, sharing tall tales about mysterious creatures that lived deep in the snow-covered forest and moved differently during the cold months. Just typical winter camping stories, the kind of thing that seems fun and harmless when you're huddled together, staying warm in the wilderness. I should have paid more attention to how seriously Emma was taking everything. While the rest of us were focused on staying warm and managing the challenges of winter camping, she was treating this like a legitimate research expedition. She'd brought that notebook I mentioned, and she was constantly scribbling down observations, even with frozen fingers. Every unusual sound in the winter forest, every pattern in the snow that couldn't immediately be explained, every shadow that seemed out of place got written down as potential evidence. The weird stuff started on our very first night. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, especially when I'm winter camping and exhausted from snowshoeing all day in heavy gear. But something woke me up around 2:15 a.m. I remember checking my watch. At first, I thought it might be my dad getting up to check our food cache, which we'd secured in bear canisters 50 yards from our tents and buried in the snow. But then I heard it clearly, heavy footsteps circling our campsite, crunching through the snow. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were deliberate, methodical footsteps that sounded disturbingly human-like, except they seemed too heavy and spaced too far apart to be from a normal person walking through snow. I lay in my sleeping bag, perfectly still, listening to whatever it was walk a complete circuit around our 3 winter tents. The footsteps would pause occasionally, like the thing was stopping to examine something, then continue. The stride length suggested something much taller than a human, and the weight behind each step indicated incredible mass moving through the snow. It took maybe 15 minutes for the circuit to complete, and then the sounds faded back into the winter forest. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept listening for the footsteps to return, but the rest of the night was quiet except for normal winter forest sounds. The occasional crack of a tree in the cold, the soft whisper of snow falling from branches, the gentle bubbling of the unfrozen creek. When morning came, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But Emma was up early, more energetic than anyone has a right to be after sleeping in sub-freezing temperatures. She immediately started talking about the visitor we'd had during the night. According to her, she'd seen a tall, dark figure moving through the snow-covered trees just outside our camp around 2 a.m. She described it as walking upright like a person, but much bigger and covered in dark hair that stood out starkly against the white snow. The details she provided were remarkably specific: the creature's height, its broad shoulders, the way it moved with deliberate purpose through the snow rather than the random wandering of a wild animal. My parents laughed it off as a dream or her imagination running wild in the unfamiliar winter environment. Dad suggested it was probably just a bear moving through the area, which was entirely possible. Bears don't fully hibernate and do sometimes emerge during winter to search for food, and they can appear surprisingly large and human-like when they're walking on their hind legs through snow. But I wasn't so sure it was nothing. After breakfast, while my family began planning the day's activities, I walked around the perimeter of our campsite looking for any signs of our nighttime visitor. What I found made my stomach drop despite the cold air. There were tracks in the snow near the creek, and they definitely weren't from any of us. These prints were massive, easily twice the size of my dad's size 12 winter boots, and shaped like human feet, but proportionally wider and longer. The impressions showed clear detail of 5 distinct toes, and the depth of the tracks suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy, pressing deep into the snow. I measured one track against my own snowshoe, and the footprint was at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at the widest point. The depth varied depending on the consistency of the snow, but in the firmest areas the impressions were nearly 4 inches deep. More disturbing was the pattern of the tracks. They showed the creature had indeed walked a complete circle around our campsite, just as I'd heard during the night. The spacing between prints indicated a stride length of nearly 5 feet, suggesting something much taller than any human moving through the snow. I didn't tell my parents about the tracks immediately. I figured they'd just come up with some rational explanation, and Emma was already excited enough without adding fuel to her monster hunting obsession. But privately, I was starting to get nervous about what exactly we'd encountered in this remote winter wilderness. The rest of that first day passed relatively normally for winter camping. We went on short snowshoe expeditions around our base camp. Emma collected interesting icicles and unusual snow formations for her notebook, and my parents relaxed and enjoyed being disconnected from the civilized world in this winter wonderland. But I noticed that Emma kept looking back toward the forest, like she was expecting to see something watching us from behind the snow-covered trees. Her behavior was becoming more focused and purposeful. She'd stop suddenly during our snowshoe hikes, standing perfectly still as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear over the winter wind. When I asked her about it, she'd just say she was paying attention to the winter forest or listening to the sounds animals make in the snow. That evening, when I checked the memory cards from my trail cameras for the first time, I was both disappointed and intrigued by what I found. The camera by the creek had captured several normal winter wildlife encounters, a family of raccoons coming to drink from the unfrozen water around midnight, various winter birds throughout the day, and one clear shot of a black bear that had approached the water around dawn. The camera on the game trail had triggered twice during the night, but both recordings showed only darkness, with the sound of something large moving through the snow just outside the infrared range. Whatever had triggered the motion sensor was staying just beyond the camera's ability to capture clear footage in the winter conditions. The camera overlooking our campsite showed us setting up our winter camp and going about our normal activities throughout the day, but around 2:20 a.m. it had captured something that made my blood run cold. A massive, dark shape moved through the frame, just at the edge of the infrared's range. The figure was enormous, clearly much larger than a human, and moved with an upright, bipedal gait through the snow. The footage was frustratingly brief and unclear due to the winter conditions and darkness. The creature appeared for maybe 3 seconds as it passed between 2 large snow-covered trees, moving with deliberate purpose but staying just far enough away to remain partly obscured by shadows and falling snow. What I could see suggested something roughly humanoid, but proportioned differently than any person, broader shoulders, longer arms, and an overall mass that seemed impossible. I enhanced the footage as much as possible using the basic editing software on my laptop, but it remained tantalizingly unclear. The shape was definitely there, definitely large, definitely walking upright through the snow, but the image quality wasn't sufficient to prove anything definitive to a skeptical audience. Still, combined with the tracks and the sounds I'd heard, the footage convinced me that we'd encountered something unusual in this winter wilderness. I just wasn't sure what it was or what it wanted. The second day is when Emma's behavior became genuinely concerning. She woke up claiming she'd had the most vivid dream about communicating with a winter forest dweller who lived among the snow-covered trees. In her dream, this creature was lonely during the harsh winter months and curious about humans, but too cautious to approach our campsite directly. She spent the morning asking increasingly specific questions about Sasquatch winter behavior patterns. Were they more active during winter? Could they communicate through sounds that carried well in cold air? Were they more likely to approach children because children posed less of a threat in the snow? My parents continued to treat it all as harmless curiosity, but I was getting worried about how fixated she was becoming. Around midday, I caught her doing something that really concerned me. I found her at the edge of our campsite, carefully arranging small piles of food on flat rocks she'd cleared of snow, positioned at regular intervals along the forest boundary. Trail mix, energy bars, some dried fruit from our winter rations, basically creating little offerings like she was trying to communicate with something specific. When I questioned her about it, she claimed she'd read that leaving food offerings in winter was a good way to help wildlife during the harsh months, and observe them without scaring them away. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but something about the purposeful arrangement of the food in the snow seemed less like wildlife observation and more like an attempt at interspecies communication. I convinced her that feeding wild animals was dangerous and could attract bears to our winter campsites, so she reluctantly helped me clean up the food offerings. But I could tell she wasn't happy about it, and she kept looking back toward the snow-covered tree line like she was disappointed about not being able to leave her gifts. Throughout the rest of the day, Emma's behavior became increasingly unusual. I caught her having what looked like one-sided conversations with empty spaces in the winter forest. She'd stop walking, stand perfectly still in the snow, and appear to be listening intently to something the rest of us couldn't hear over the winter wind. When I asked her about it, she'd just say she was listening to the winter forest or paying attention to how sounds traveled differently in the cold air. But I was watching her more carefully now, and it wasn't just pretend play or imagination. She genuinely seemed to believe she was receiving some form of communication. She'd nod like she was agreeing with someone, shake her head like she was disagreeing, even smile like she was enjoying a pleasant conversation despite the cold. My parents began noticing her strange behavior too, but they attributed it to her being overstimulated by finally getting to winter camp in supposed Bigfoot territory. Dad suggested she was just role-playing her monster hunting fantasies, which was probably normal for a kid her age with such vivid interests, especially in the dramatic winter setting. That evening, when I downloaded the footage from my trail cameras, I found something that made my heart race. The camera positioned to watch our campsite had captured Emma sneaking out of her tent around 12:45 a.m. the previous night. The timestamp showed she'd been outside for nearly an hour and 20 minutes, walking around the edge of our winter camp in her red jacket and appearing to interact with something beyond the camera's range. The footage was grainy and the infrared gave everything a ghostly quality against the snow, but I could clearly see Emma standing at various points along the tree line, gesturing like she was having a conversation with someone just outside the camera's field of view. At one point, she reached out her hand like she was offering something to an unseen presence in the winter darkness. What really disturbed me was her body language. She didn't look scared, confused, or even particularly cold despite being outside in freezing temperatures. She looked comfortable, even happy, like she was talking to someone she trusted, someone she'd been expecting to meet in the winter night. Around 2:10 a.m. in the footage, she suddenly turned toward the forest and began walking toward the trees, her red jacket bright against the snow. The camera lost sight of her as she moved beyond its range, but she didn't return to the frame until nearly 2:30 a.m. When she reappeared, she was coming from a completely different direction, suggesting she'd traveled some distance into the winter forest during those 20 minutes. She spent a few more minutes standing at the edge of camp, apparently concluding her mysterious conversation before quietly returning to her tent. Her movements were confident and purposeful throughout the entire encounter, showing none of the hesitation you'd expect from a child sneaking around in a dark, frozen forest. I watched that footage dozens of times, looking for any sign of what or who Emma might have been interacting with in the winter darkness. The camera angle and infrared limitations made it impossible to see clearly into the forest beyond our immediate campsite. But Emma's behavior strongly suggested she wasn't alone out there in the snow. The way she was looking and gesturing indicated she was responding to someone or something that was communicating back to her. This wasn't a child playing pretend games in the middle of a winter night. This was a genuine interaction with some unseen presence. I decided not to tell my parents about the footage immediately. I needed to understand what was happening before potentially sending everyone into a panic. Maybe Emma was experiencing some kind of winter-induced sleepwalking, or maybe she was acting out her fantasies more dramatically than we'd realized. But as I watched her behavior on the second day, I became convinced that whatever was happening was real from her perspective. She moved through our winter campsite with increasing confidence, like she was familiar with the area in a way that went beyond our brief time there. During our afternoon snowshoe expedition, she began demonstrating knowledge about the winter forest that she shouldn't have possessed. She knew which snow-covered trails led where, which areas had the best access to unfrozen water, even which trees provided the most shelter from winter winds. When my parents asked how she knew these things, she'd just shrug and say she was good at reading the winter landscape. More concerning was the way she interacted with the snowy environment. She'd touch certain trees like she was greeting old friends, arrange chunks of snow in specific patterns that seemed meaningful to her, and regularly paused to listen to sounds that none of us could detect in the winter air. That evening, she barely touched her dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry because she had been snacking on winter berries throughout the day. When my mother asked her to show us where she had found these berries, Emma became evasive, saying she just found them here and there during our snowshoe hikes. But I knew she hadn't eaten any berries during our group activities. If she was finding food sources in winter, she was doing it during times when she was separated from the family, times that, according to our supervision, didn't exist. I decided to stay awake and watch Emma's tent on the second night. I positioned myself where I could see her tent entrance while remaining hidden behind our equipment pile. If she tried to sneak out again into the winter night, I wanted to see exactly what was happening. Around 1:20 a.m., Emma quietly unzipped her tent and emerged into the moonlit winter campsite. She was fully dressed in her red winter jacket and moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey before. She walked directly to the tree line without hesitation, as if she knew exactly where she was going through the snow. I followed at a distance, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to observe her actions in the winter landscape. What I witnessed challenged everything I thought I understood about the situation. Emma walked to a specific spot at the forest edge and stopped, apparently waiting for something. After about 5 minutes, I heard sounds coming from the snow-covered trees. Not random forest noise, but what seemed like purposeful communication. Low, rhythmic sounds that were almost language-like, but unlike any human speech I'd ever heard, carrying clearly in the cold air. Emma responded to these sounds with her own vocalizations, Not words exactly, but meaningful sounds that seemed to be part of some communication system. She was having a conversation in the winter night, but not in any language I recognized. After several minutes of this exchange, Emma walked into the forest and disappeared from my view among the snow-laden trees. I wanted to follow her, but the winter darkness and dense vegetation made it impossible to track her movements without making noise that would certainly reveal my presence. I waited at the forest edge for nearly an hour, shivering in the cold before Emma finally returned. When she emerged from the trees, she wasn't alone. I could see a massive, dark shape moving through the winter forest just behind her, staying carefully in the shadows but clearly accompanying her back toward our camp. The shape was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, and moved with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to winter forest travel. It stayed at the tree line while Emma walked back to her tent, but I could see it watching our campsite for several minutes before melting back into the winter darkness. Emma returned to her tent as quietly as she had left, and I retreated to my own sleeping bag with my mind racing. What I'd witnessed was impossible to explain through conventional reasoning. My 11-year-old sister was conducting regular meetings with something that shouldn't exist, and she was doing it with the confidence and familiarity of an established relationship, even in harsh winter conditions. The third day brought a sense of finality that I couldn't quite explain. Emma moved through our winter activities with distracted attention, like someone who was mentally preparing for something important. She participated in our planned snowshoe hikes and camp activities, but I could tell her thoughts were elsewhere. During our afternoon exploration of a nearby snow-covered ridge, Emma made several comments about how much she loved the winter wilderness and how she felt more at home here than anywhere else. She talked about how humans had lost touch with the natural world and how much better life would be if people could learn to live as part of the winter forest rather than separate from it. My parents smiled at what they perceived as childhood philosophizing, but her words carried a weight and conviction that seemed beyond her years. She was speaking from experience, not imagination, about life in the winter wilderness. That evening, as we prepared what was supposed to be our final dinner at the winter campsite, Emma barely participated in the conversation. She kept looking toward the snow-covered forest with an expression I couldn't quite read, anticipation mixed with sadness, like someone preparing to say goodbye. When bedtime came, she hugged each of us with unusual intensity. At the time, I thought she was just sad about leaving our winter adventure behind. Now I understand she was saying farewell. I woke up around 6:30 a.m. on the fourth day to the sound of my parents frantically calling Emma's name. Her sleeping bag was empty and cold, suggesting she'd been gone for hours. Her backpack was missing, along with her notebook and some of her winter clothes. At first, my parents assumed she'd just gotten up early to explore or use the bathroom area we'd established downstream. But as minutes turned into an hour with no sign of her in the winter landscape, panic began setting in. We searched every inch of our immediate area, calling her name until our voices echoed across the snow-covered wilderness. Dad organized us into a systematic search pattern. Mom stayed at the campsite in case Emma returned on her own, while Dad and I searched in expanding circles around our camp. The winter forest was dense enough that someone could be 50 feet away and completely invisible behind snow-covered trees, so we moved slowly and methodically. What we found about 300 yards from our campsite made everything much worse. Emma's small boot prints were clearly visible in a patch of undisturbed snow beside a fallen log. But alongside her prints were those same massive tracks I'd found on previous days. The story told by the tracks in the snow was clear but impossible to accept. Emma's prints showed she'd been walking normally, stopping occasionally like she was waiting for something or someone. The large prints approached from deeper in the forest, and for several yards, both sets of tracks continued side by side through the snow. Then Emma's footprints disappeared entirely. The large tracks continued, but they were deeper now, pressed further into the snow like whatever made them was carrying additional weight. Emma hadn't been dragged or chased through the winter forest. According to the evidence, she had walked willingly with whatever had those massive feet, and then been picked up and carried away across the snow. While Dad used our emergency satellite communicator to contact the authorities, I rushed back to check my trail cameras. What I found on those memory cards answered every question about what had happened to Emma, but created new questions that were even more disturbing. The camera positioned to monitor our campsite had captured the entire incident with crystal clarity. The timestamp showed Emma leaving her tent at 4:23 a.m., nearly 3 hours before any of us had woken up. She moved confidently through the winter campsite in her bright red jacket, like she knew exactly where she was going and who she was meeting. The footage showed her walking directly to a specific spot at the tree line and waiting in the snow. She stood there for exactly 4 minutes, perfectly still, like she was listening for a predetermined signal in the winter air. Then it appeared. A massive, dark figure emerged from the shadows between the snow-covered trees. And even in the infrared footage, it was clearly not human. The creature was enormous, easily 8.5 feet tall, covered in thick, dark hair that contrasted sharply with the white snow, with proportions that were humanoid but unmistakably different. Its arms were longer than a human's, its shoulders impossibly broad, its entire frame suggesting strength and mass that belonged to no known species. But what shocked me most was Emma's reaction. She showed no fear whatsoever. When the creature stepped into view through the snow, she actually walked toward it, raising her hand in what was clearly a greeting gesture. The creature knelt down in the snow to Emma's eye level, and I could see them interacting, though the camera's audio wasn't sensitive enough to pick up any conversation over the winter wind. They appeared to be communicating through a combination of gestures and vocalizations, a language they'd obviously developed during their previous encounters. After several minutes of what looked like farewell conversation, the creature stood back up and gently lifted Emma onto its shoulders. She settled there like she'd done it many times before, wrapping her small arms around the creature's massive neck with complete trust and familiarity. Her red jacket was bright against the creature's dark fur. Then both of them disappeared into the winter forest, moving deeper into the wilderness than any search team would ever penetrate. The creature's movements were fluid and purposeful, carrying Emma through the snow with the care of a parent transporting a beloved child. The footage was undeniable evidence of what had happened, but it was also evidence that no one would ever believe. Emma hadn't been abducted by some mindless winter beast. She'd made a conscious decision to leave with a creature she'd been secretly communicating with for days. The official search for Emma lasted 9 days and involved over 60 people. Park rangers, volunteers, search dogs, helicopter teams when weather permitted. They combed hundreds of square miles of winter wilderness, following every possible trail and checking every potential hiding spot that could provide shelter in the harsh conditions. I couldn't tell them about the footage. Who would believe that my sister had voluntarily left with a Sasquatch in the middle of winter? I'd be dismissed as a traumatized family member creating elaborate fantasies to cope with an unbearable situation. So I kept the evidence to myself and participated in the search efforts, all while knowing they were looking in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. My parents were devastated. Mom barely slept or ate, spending her days staring into the snow-covered forest like she could will Emma to come walking back to us across the white landscape. Dad threw himself into organizing search efforts, refusing to accept that professional teams might not find her alive in the winter conditions. But I was watching the ongoing story through my trail cameras. I'd positioned them to monitor wildlife, but now they were my only connection to Emma's fate. And what they showed me over those 9 days was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. The cameras captured Emma and the creature multiple times as they moved deeper into the winter wilderness. In every piece of footage, Emma appeared healthy and unharmed despite the harsh conditions. The creature seemed protective of her, always scanning their surroundings for threats, ensuring she stayed warm and had access to food and unfrozen water. One particularly clear video showed them resting beside a partially frozen stream about 6 miles from our original campsite. Emma was drinking from the clear water while the creature offered her what looked like winter berries and edible roots it had found despite the snow cover. She was laughing at something, completely relaxed in her red jacket, like she was on the adventure of her lifetime. The creature's behavior was unlike any animal I'd ever observed. It used tools, created winter shelter, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that seemed almost human. When snow fell heavily, the creature built a sophisticated lean-to shelter from branches and evergreen boughs to keep Emma warm and dry. When they needed to cross frozen streams, it carried her carefully to avoid breaking through the ice. Most remarkably, the creature seemed to be teaching her winter survival skills. Footage showed it demonstrating how to identify edible plants that remained available in winter, how to find sources of unfrozen water, how to move efficiently through deep snow without exhausting energy. Emma was learning to survive in the winter wilderness under the guidance of something that shouldn't exist. Over the following weeks and months, I collected hundreds of hours of footage showing Emma's transformation through the changing seasons. The trail cameras I'd left behind became windows into a world that defied everything I thought I knew about reality. Emma was thriving. Within weeks of disappearing, she was moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who belonged there, adapting as winter gradually gave way to spring. Her red jacket was eventually replaced with garments made from animal hides and plant fibers as the seasons changed. Her hair grew longer and became interwoven with natural materials. She began to look like a wild child, perfectly adapted to forest life. But she was never alone. The creature that had taken her, I started thinking of it as her guardian, was always nearby. And gradually the footage revealed that they weren't the only ones. There was an entire family group of these creatures living in the deepest parts of the forest. I counted at least 5 different individuals over the months of observation. There was what appeared to be an elder, distinguished by its grayer coloring and more deliberate movements. A female that seemed to be the group's leader, making decisions about their movements and activities. A younger creature that might have been an adolescent, often playing with Emma and teaching her forest skills. And 2 others whose roles in the group hierarchy weren't immediately clear. They all interacted with Emma with patience and gentleness, treating her like an adopted member of their family. The footage showed Emma learning their ways of life, becoming skilled at foraging and finding food sources that kept her healthy and strong. She learned to build shelters, to read weather patterns, to communicate through their complex system of gestures and vocalizations. Most remarkably, she seemed genuinely happy. In every piece of footage, Emma appeared content and engaged with her new life. She played with the younger creature, learned from the adults, and explored her environment with the same enthusiasm she'd always shown for new experiences. As seasons changed from winter to spring to summer, the footage showed the group adapting their territory and behavior to match the natural cycles. They constructed different types of shelters for different weather conditions, followed migration patterns of prey animals, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of their ecosystem. Emma participated in all these activities with increasing skill and confidence. She was no longer a human child being cared for by forest creatures. She was becoming something unique, a bridge between 2 worlds. Adapted to wilderness life but retaining her human intelligence and creativity. 18 months after Emma's disappearance, something extraordinary happened. One of my trail cameras captured footage of her approaching the edge of our original campsite, alone. She looked completely different from the 11-year-old who'd vanished that February morning. She was taller, stronger, and moved with the fluid grace of someone perfectly adapted to forest life. Her hair was long and wild, decorated with feathers and small bones. Her skin was weathered by constant exposure to the elements, and her clothing was entirely crafted from natural materials. But it was unmistakably Emma. The footage showed her spending nearly 2 hours at the campsite, walking around the area where our tents had been pitched, touching trees and rocks like she was connecting with memories of her former life. She seemed to be conducting some kind of ritual, acknowledging her past while affirming her commitment to her chosen future. Then she did something that brought tears to my eyes. She pulled out a piece of bark and began creating marks on it with what looked like charcoal from an old campfire. When she finished, she placed the drawing on the flat rock where we'd prepared meals, positioning it where it would be easily visible to anyone who might find it. She stepped back and looked directly at the camera. For a long moment, she stared straight into the lens, and I knew she was aware of my presence even though I was hundreds of miles away. She raised her hand in a small wave, smiled the same radiant smile I remembered from her childhood, and mouthed words I couldn't hear but clearly understood. Then she disappeared back into the forest, moving with the silence and speed of someone who belonged entirely to the wild. I retrieved that bark drawing the following week. It showed stick figures that were clearly meant to represent her new family, several large, hairy figures surrounding a smaller human figure. All of the figures were holding hands, and there were symbols around them that seemed to represent their forest home. Trees, mountains, streams, and caves. But what struck me most was that the human figure in the drawing was smiling. Emma had created a picture showing herself happy and safe with her adopted family, a message intended to reassure anyone who might be wondering about her fate. For several more months, I continued to capture occasional footage of Emma and her family group. They seemed to be thriving in their hidden world, moving through territories that no human had ever mapped, living according to patterns and rhythms that belonged entirely to the wilderness. Emma continued to grow and change, becoming something unprecedented, a human who had successfully transitioned to life among creatures that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted reality. She retained enough of her humanity to remember her origins and to occasionally think of the family she'd left behind. But she'd adapted so completely to her new life that she'd become something entirely unique. The last clear footage I captured showed her one final time, approaching a camera location where she'd left another bark drawing. This one was more complex, showing the geography of her new world: forests, mountains, hidden valleys, and cave systems that made up the territory her family called home. At the bottom of the bark, she'd scratched what looked like symbols that might have been words. "Don't look for me." After placing the drawing where it would be found, she walked directly to the camera and placed her hand on the tree where it was mounted. For several seconds, she looked straight into the lens with an expression that seemed to contain years of experience and wisdom far beyond her chronological age. Then she did something that still gives me chills. She reached up and gently disconnected the camera, ending my window into her world forever. I returned to check the cameras a week later and found that all of them had been systematically disabled, not damaged or destroyed, just carefully disconnected and powered down. Emma and her family had made it clear that their privacy needed to be respected and that my observations were no longer welcome. It's been 3 years now since Emma disappeared into the winter wilderness. My parents have slowly learned to live with their loss, though they have never stopped hoping she might somehow return. They don't know about the footage, about the evidence that she's alive and thriving in a world that exists parallel to ours, but remains invisible to most human perception. I've debated telling them countless times. The knowledge that their daughter is safe and happy might bring them comfort. But I'm also afraid it would drive them to attempt their own search, potentially putting them in danger and definitely disturbing the new life Emma has chosen for herself. Because that's what I've come to understand. This was entirely her choice. The footage clearly shows that she went willingly, that she adapted by choice rather than force, and that she actively chose to cut ties with our world completely. I still maintain some of the trail cameras, though they haven't captured anything significant since Emma disabled the original units. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement in the far background of routine wildlife footage, shadows that might be members of her adopted family moving through their territory at the extreme edge of camera range. But mostly, I just have to accept that Emma exists in a world I can't access, living a life I can barely imagine. She's become something unique in human history, a bridge between human and wild, someone who chose the unknown over the familiar and found happiness in that choice. The footage I captured remains my secret, stored on encrypted drives that I may never share with anyone. It's evidence of a world that exists just beyond the edge of what we accept as possible. Proof that some disappearances aren't tragedies but transformations. Emma chose her path, and while I miss her terribly, I respect that choice. Somewhere in the deepest wilderness, she's living a life that most people would consider impossible. She's safe, she's happy, and she's home. And sometimes, on quiet winter nights when the civilized world feels too small and predictable, I find myself envying her freedom. For more interesting stories, check this out.